Historian Christopher Duffy, writing about the 18th century, observed that the most pronounced moral traits of the English were violence and patriotism. Now, to modern ears, that might sound shocking, perhaps even embarrassing, but what happens if he was right? And what if understanding that quote explains both how Britain became one of the most successful nations in history and why so many people feel such frustration today? Samuel Johnson, another historian, described Britain as a peasantry of heroes. Not because the people were obedient, not because they blindly followed authority, quite the opposite, in fact. Johnson believed that British courage sprang from what he called a want of subordination. The people were difficult to control. The people were difficult to govern, stubborn, independent, and Johnson gave us perhaps one of the greatest observations ever made about free people. They who complain in peace of the insolence of the population must remember that their insolence in peace is bravery in war. Think about that. The same characteristics that make people difficult to manage often make them almost impossible to conquer. For generations, Britain was built by that type of people. Sailors, miners, farmers, tradesmen, labourers, soldiers, people who worked, people who fought, people who built, people who expected to have a say in the future of their country. And perhaps that's the strangest thing about modern Britain. People watch the French today shut down motorways over tax increases, farmers blockading roads across Europe, entire communities in Northern Ireland mobilising about issues that they care about. And many people look on in amazement, as though these things belong to another people, another culture. But they forget their own history. The Chartists, the Reformers, the trade union movement before it got compromised, the suffragettes, working men demanding representation, communities organising themselves to challenge power. British history is not merely a story of obedience. It's also a story of pressure, negotiation, agitation and reform. Not so long ago, British people were every bit as capable of forcing change when they believed something mattered. Which brings us to today. Across Britain, millions of people increasingly feel disconnected from the institutions that are supposed to govern them. The governments change, prime ministers come and go, but the frustrations remain the same. And whether those frustrations concern immigration, housing, crime, the economy, public services, or something else entirely, a growing number of people are asking the same question. Who's actually listening? Because democracy is not simply about voting in a by-election. It's about representation. It's about legitimacy. It's about citizens believing that their voice matters. And when that belief begins to weaken, every institution will feel the strain. Parliament, the media, the courts, the civil service, the police, and all those institutions that depend upon public confidence. And confidence, once lost, is incredibly difficult to recover. Now let's talk about immigration. Not because it's the only issue, but because it's become a symbol of a much larger debate. And on this, my position is quite simple. Controlled immigration is normal. Every successful society throughout history has welcomed people who wanted to become part of it. The people who work, the people who contribute, the people who strengthen the nation they join. And there's nothing controversial about that. But every successful society expects something in return. Respect the law, learn the language, understand the customs, accept the rules, contribute more than you take. And that's not because one culture is superior to another, but because no society can survive if it expects nothing from those who join it. And in this country, we don't need a caste system. We don't need first and second class citizens. We don't need permanent outsiders. But we do need standards. Because the real question is not, where did you come from? The real question is, do you strengthen the country or weaken it? And those standards should apply equally to everybody. And I mean everybody. The person born here, the person who arrived yesterday, the wealthy, the poor, the powerful, the ordinary citizen. One standard, one law, one social contract. Because we've already got enough criminals of our own. We've already got enough freeloaders. We've already got enough people abusing the system. We do not need any more, regardless of where they were born. And perhaps that brings us to the real issue. For centuries, Britain avoided the revolutions that consumed much of Europe. Not because the British people were passive, not because they lacked courage, and certainly not because they lacked the ability to do violence. Britain avoided revolution because the system adapted. We had the Reform Act, the expansion of voting rights, parliamentary reform, trade union rights. Power always bent before it broke. And that is one of Britain's greatest traditions. Not revolution, but reform. And history teaches us something very important about this. People will tolerate hardship. People will tolerate mistakes. People will even tolerate failure. But what they will not tolerate indefinitely is the belief that they no longer matter, that their voice no longer counts, that nobody is listening. Because when people lose faith in reform, they begin looking elsewhere for answers. That is the moment every successful society must avoid. And that is why I believe Britain right now stands at a crossroads. Not because collapse is inevitable, not because revolution is inevitable, but because renewal is necessary. And for me, the answer isn't violence. The answer isn't tearing all the system down. The answer is legitimacy, accountability, citizenship, and a renewed social contract. That's not because collapse is inevitable. It's not because revolution is inevitable, but because renewal is necessary. And I believe that the answer isn't violence. I don't believe that the answer is tearing everything down and starting again. I think the answer is legitimacy, accountability, citizenship, and a renewed social contract. We also need institutions that serve the people and citizens, all citizens, who understand their responsibilities both to the nation and to one another. Because perhaps the real question facing Britain right now is not who should govern. Perhaps the deeper question is, how do we, as a nation, rebuild trust? How do we restore legitimacy? How do we make government answerable to the people once more? Because if the nation state was an experiment, perhaps it's time for the next evolution.